Well, hopefully this video doesn't get taken down multiple times, which is a safe bet that it won't because it's really nothing that explicit, because today I want to talk about Neoclassical Darkwave. What's Neoclassical Darkwave, you might ask? Well, it's a style of music that blends both Neoclassical and Darkwave together. A very obvious synopsis, I'm aware, but now the question is, what is Neoclassical and what is Darkwave by themselves? Starting with Neoclassical, which is quite difficult to define precisely what it is when you consider the fact that classical music and neoclassical music really don't have many differences in terms of how they were conducted. The only differences people tend to point out that separates these two is that when you refer to classical music, you're talking about a time period of the early 18th to early 19th century, whereas with neoclassical, you're talking about music from the early 20th century to basically present day. If there's any information that I'm lacking on classical and neoclassical, definitely let me know. But I think a huge reason as to why we refer to this style of music as neoclassical darkwave is that all this music that I'll be talking about was released around the late 20th century of the 1980s to early 1990s. As for darkwave, the best way I could summarize this style of music is it's a branch off of post-punk music. So when you think of post-punk, its origins in the late 70s, think of something like Joy Division. And from there, what came of it was new wave. And what is new wave now? New wave is essentially the styles of post-punk, only it was expanded upon by adding in more of the structure in terms of melody and more of like this pop kind of like essence with their sound. So now think of something like Tears for Fears. And what darkwave essentially is now you focus on new wave and replace all the pop essence with more of these like gothic influences that made it more dark and moody sounding, and thus you would get something like Zymox. And when you put these two styles of music together, that being neoclassical and darkwave, essentially what you get with the neoclassical influence is a lot of these stringed instruments that create a lot of different layers of composition that makes everything sound super ethereal. Whereas with the darkwave influence, which I've noticed a lot of the musicians and artists that utilize darkwave here tend to use it more in like this minimalistic sense to create a backdrop for all the compositions to sound darker and more moody, thus making that ethereal sound that the neoclassical is giving off almost give off more of like this melancholic vibe with it. Its presentation all adds up, because even though this style of music is called neoclassical dark wave, which you would think it's rooted way more into like classical influence in the scene and territory, that's not the case. Let it be known here that neoclassical darkwave is way more rooted in the gothic scene and sound than anything else. Before I get into the discussion of all of the neoclassical darkwave albums and artists that were pioneers and some like really essential stuff for this style of music, I just want to state on a personal note here that when I listen to neoclassical darkwave, it's not really a style of music that you listen to that you skip tracks or there's one standout track in the album and you have to replay it over and over again. For me personally, with this style of music, every album that I've heard feels like one conceptual piece, because a lot of these songs here are going to range around 7 and 10 minutes long. That's kind of like the norm. So don't think of like tracks that are going to be 3 to 4 minutes where they have like, you know, hooks that you kind of like latch onto and kind of like snap your fingers or head bop with. These are songs that I really do feel like ambience, atmosphere, and composition is supposed to engulf you. Thus, every album feels like one conceptual piece of one song. So I just want to state that here, that for all of these albums and artists that I'll be talking about, which I feel like are all great and worthy of diving into, if you decide to listen to them, definitely let it sink in with you and give these albums your time, because everything just kind of like flows together in terms of how these set lists are for these albums. Now, when it comes to the origins of neoclassical darkwave, what's the first real representation of it, a lot of people point to Dead Can Dance as being the real pioneers for it. While Dead Can Dance had a lot of different musicians come in and out of it in terms of what albums you're looking for, the real true two members that are the heart and soul for it would be Brendan Perry and Lisa Gerrard, which, one thing to point out here already this early on when talking about Neoclassical Darkwave and what Dead Can Dance kind of represented to everyone, is that even though they are musicians and they play their instruments live and in the studio, they're often viewed as conductors for everything being played out on their albums, which I've noticed when it comes to everyone else I'll be talking about in Neoclassical Darkwave, is that they look at themselves more as conductors than just another musician that can play a guitar. What's interesting to point out with Dead Can Dance's origins is that originally they weren't a neoclassical darkwave group, because when you look at their debut full-length album that was released in 1984, that being their self-titled, it was way more in vein of post-punk and new wave. Again, taking a lot of inspiration from Joy Division, but what's interesting to point out here is that they were kind of expanding the sound of post-punk a little bit, considering the fact that the compositions and overall melodies were a bit more ethereal sounding than what most post-punk bands were doing, I feel like. And again, that ethereal sound becomes somewhat of a staple within neoclassical darkwave as a whole. So it's kind of interesting to look at it with Dead Can Dance. Not only are they the pioneers for neoclassical darkwave, but they're even like the prototypes for it as well, which many tend to believe if you want to get into neoclassical darkwave in any sense, whether you're starting out, you're a veteran listener, or you know everything about it, it is essential to bring these guys up in some way, shape, or form. Case in point, because when you look at their follow-up full-length album that came out a year later in 1985, Spleen and Ideal, for a lot of people, this is considered to be the first album in representation of pure neoclassical darkwave. From what I've read in interviews and heard from Dead Can Dance, is that Brendan Perry was taking more interest with learning about music theory, and Lisa Gerrard was having more influence on like world music as a whole instead of just, you know, post-punk influences. Thus, both of these artists really started to experiment and be more ambitious and try for a whole different style. Thus, they really transcended their approach into music to something completely new that would really define and paint the blueprints for what neoclassical darkwave was going to become. Thus, it would influence a whole new generation of artists. However, what's often regarded as the magnum opus within the Dead Can Dance discography with their approach of neoclassical darkwave, it would go to their third full-length album in 1987 titled Within the Realm of a Dying Sun. Spleen and Ideal laid out the blueprints for this style of music, but Within the Realm of a Dying Sun perfected it. The reason for that is with the previous album, Spleen and Ideal, they were still relying on gothic rock influences with the instruments of guitar, bass, and acoustic drums, whereas Within the Realm of a Dying Sun, they're putting a lot more emphasis on the synthesizers and the darkwave influence, making everything come off a lot more impactful and dreadful, honestly. One of my favorite features about this album, and funny enough it's something that people tend to criticize about it negatively, is that the keyboards sound dated. It wasn't the most like high quality, up-to-date kind of equipment that they were using, which I personally feel like that's what gives this album its charm, considering the fact that with neoclassical and it trying to be more in like this romanticizing of like things from the past of like centuries ago, it definitely gives it its charm, I feel like. And for me personally, this album's kind of aged like fine wine on how dated the keyboards sound on here, and it really complements, again, the melancholic and dreadful mood and vibe they're going for. I also enjoyed how they utilized the set list on this album, where the first half has all the material of Brendan Perry singing, and the second half has all the material of Lisa Gerrard singing. Which also now leads to another big compliment I gotta give this album, that being Lisa Gerrard's vocal performance on here would become a staple for all and anything to do with neoclassical darkwave music, because she tends to have her voice registered at a much higher pitch now in the soprano vocal range. Thus, now, one thing I've noticed with all the material regarding Lisa Gerrard on it, from Dead Can Dance to anything else she's done, is that you really don't listen to her vocals in the sense of you want to sing along with it or follow just the rhythm pattern. It's more of just like this extra layer of ambience and melody kind of like laced through all the instrumentation that just adds to the ethereal nature of really Dead Can Dance, along with just this style of music as a whole. Honestly, I could sit here for hours gushing all about Dead Can Dance, to the point that I was really tempted, instead of making a video being this, explaining Neoclassical Darkwave, to make one on explaining Dead Can Dance. Maybe someday down the road I'll do that, but for the time being, I feel like if you were to discuss Neoclassical Darkwave, I really do feel like Dead Can Dance is the most impactful, that they're basically the alpha and omega of everything you need to know about this style of music. Although, since I have the chance here, I would also recommend really all of their other works, from The Serpent's Egg, Aeon, Into the Labyrinth, and everything after that. It's just, I'm not going to be talking about it here on this particular video, because even though all those albums are still heavily rooted in Neoclassical Darkwave, which again I would recommend checking out, they started to deviate a little bit from that style of its core and started adding in influences of all different like subcultures of music from places they've been into it, thus expanding it to a whole different region, I feel like, which again kind of gets a bit off topic. But I would strongly recommend checking them out regardless, because it's all incredible pieces of music. As it's common knowledge within this subject matter to know about Dead Can Dance, another important figure that I feel like kind of gets glossed over that was active around the same time as Dead Can Dance would be In the Nursery. Just like Dead Can Dance, In the Nursery is a duo consisting of two brothers, Clive and Nigel Humberstone. And again, just like Dead Can Dance, they originally started out being heavily influenced by post-punk, such as Joy Division, but throughout the years towards like the late 80s to early 90s, they started experimenting more with neoclassical music and forms of darkwave. For my personal taste, their best album that showcases this in their discography is Duality, which kind of follows the formula to Neoclassical Darkwave, more so emphasis on making these tracks a lot lengthier, mainly because one thing you'll notice when you look at the synopsis of In the Nursery is that most of their work kind of gears towards making soundtracks for like TV shows or silent movies. So there's a lot more of like this soundscape types of compositions that really kind of stretch out for long periods of time to just kind of like ease you into the dark wave and moody atmosphere, which is one thing to keep in mind if you ever check out other albums by In the Nursery. They're more geared towards like, you know, soundtracks, so to say. But again, I do feel like they are glossed over heavily when it comes to the pioneers of this style of music that definitely needs a mention. As we proceed onwards into the following decade, that being the 1990s, another really important figure that honestly influenced a lot of neoclassical darkwave projects that I'll even be talking about later on in this video that again is really monumental for the style of music would be Sopor, Aeternus, and the Ensembles of Shadows. While there have been a multitude of individuals that have joined and disbanded from Sopor Aeternus, the main mastermind that has stuck with it from its beginnings to present day, that being roughly around 35 years and counting, is the individual pictured right here, Anna Varney Cantodia. It's a safe bet to say that out of everyone I'll be talking about in this video, Sopor Aeternus easily has the largest discography. Just from the 90s alone, I've counted somewhere around half a dozen full-length albums. Yet, funny enough, the album that I would recommend to start out with this project, not only to get familiar with neoclassical darkwave, but also Sopor Aeternus as a whole, is an album they released back in 2007 called Les Feux du Mal. Pardon my French for more than likely mispronouncing that album title, but getting back on track here, when it comes to Sopor Aeternus, I feel like what separates this project from really anything else I'll be talking about here is that even though it plays in the realms of obviously neoclassical darkwave, Sopor Aeternus just puts so much more emphasis on the Gothic influence. From how Anna sings, the composition, the Darkwave melodies, and how the classical kind of strings and instrumentation are laid out, it's not so much as it's trying to capture that ethereal nature like everyone else. Almost in the sense as if I feel as if when I listen to Sopor Aeternus, it's trying to like enthrall itself in the idea of being like this misery and this reclusive mindset as if it's a norm. You'll definitely hear that input from really any material by Sopor Aeternus, from the albums of the 90s to even present day, because it's still active. But I chose this particular album for a starting point, mainly because honestly, this is probably the most accessible and easiest to the ears of the bunch, because all of these like dramatic and like reclusive kind of mindsets don't really feel that overbearing on this particular album, yet it still has a lot of great material to indulge in. But just like really anything else here in this video, I would highly encourage you to really explore Sopor Aeternus's material if you're really looking for this kind of like extravagant way to create dark music. One of the many groups that were heavily influenced by Sopor Aeternus that I feel like is just equally as important for the continuation and progression of Neoclassical Darkwave would be Die Verbannten Kinder Evas. Although no longer active, originally it was a side project to that of the members of Summoning, that being Selenius and Protector, along with Protector's sister, who she contributed vocals on a handful of albums. And I feel like what makes Die Verbannten Kinder Evas really important here is not just because I'm being biased and it's the members of Summoning for me, even though it's my favorite black metal band, but what they tend to do here that makes them quite the standout is whereas others kind of take influences in terms of themes from like other kinds of cultures, or really putting a lot more emphasis on like that dark reclusive kind of mindset that really captures the Gothic aesthetic. With this project, Die Verbannten Kinder Evas, they're putting a lot more attention to detail by trying to create like these fantasy worlds. Maybe it's just I've always had this impression with this project because I always compare it to Summoning. Summoning's always had this interest with like the Tolkien universe, which again is obviously fantasy. And with Die Verbannten Kinder Evas, it's like they're mirroring that, and they're still capturing that vibe, because when you listen to the instrumentation and composition, yeah, it's not the most up-to-date, kind of like synthesizers and programs that they're using that, again, sounds dated, just like what I talked about with Dead Can Dance early on, but it gives it its charm. It sounds very animated, like, and I just can't help but always feel like I'm being transported to some, like, mystical fantasy world whenever I listen to them. As for the best album to start out in their discography, I'm honestly kind of conflicted on what I think is their best to start out with, considering the fact that originally I discovered them with their debut full-length album, that's their self-titled, which happens to be their only full-length that actually has Selenius being a part of it. And while I think it's a great album overall, the reason why I wouldn't recommend this particular album is towards the latter half of it, they start using harsh vocals that kind of resembles like the black metal sound that I feel like kind of gets a little too off track here of what I'm trying to recommend. Whereas my personal favorite of theirs happens to be their third full-length album, In Darkness Let Me Dwell. It's just, I wouldn't recommend this because it's very overbearing because of how overly dramatic these kind of like depressing themes are that can be quite off-putting if you're new to this style of music. So personally for me, what I would recommend to start out with them would be their second full-length album, Come Heavy Sleep. It clocks in a little under an hour long, that I feel like out of everything they've done, this is their most straightforward approach within Neoclassical Darkwave that doesn't deviate with other themes or experimentations like what they've done with other albums. That the overall composition just sounds a lot more grand and epic in scope. That I would say out of the 4 full-length albums they did, this is easily the most entertaining sounding. And if you're enjoying anything I've discussed thus far, then I feel like I definitely need to recommend Dark Sanctuary. These guys are a French Neoclassical Darkwave group that as of lately have kind of transformed more into like gothic metal territory while blending neoclassical together. However, one of their albums that really stands out to me personally is their debut full-length album released back in 1999, if I'm not mistaken. And what I find interesting about this is I would state this is probably the most minimalistic of the bunch, that puts a lot more emphasis with the synthesizers, that it kind of almost deviates into like dungeon synth territory, which I really like. That it kind of reminds me a little bit of like Depressive Silence if it had like soprano vocals of like a woman singing on top of it. And honestly, this is some really ethereal stuff that I feel like for just like background music to just fill up like the empty space of like silence in a room, this is honestly really soothing and gorgeous overall. Another great French neoclassical darkwave group worth mentioning here is Elend. Formed in the early 90s, Elend followed the same rhythm patterns that most neoclassical darkwave groups were doing during that time. However, towards the turn of the 21st century, they started becoming a bit more risk-taking. Thus, this is when they released back in 2003 their full-length album, Wind's Devouring Men. What's interesting to point out here with this album is that it was released by Prophecy Records, a label mostly known for releasing extreme metal such as black metal and doom metal and stuff of the sort. And you can tell that that kind of energy kind of radiates onto this particular album by Elend, because even though it still plays around the style obviously of neoclassical darkwave, towards the midway portion of this album, it becomes a lot more frightening sounding, to be honest, as there's elements of dark ambience, and it just becomes a lot more abrasive sounding, that this album really feels like a mixture between something beautiful and sinister at the same time. I would recommend this album to individuals who are looking for more of an abrasive and heavier approach with neoclassical darkwave that showcases that this style of music still has a lot of experimentation and creative ideas that can be attached with it. And it's really cool to note as well that these guys recently reformed a handful of years ago, and there has been talk for a while of a new album of theirs to be released soon, which I'm definitely going to keep a close ear to the ground for, because ever since the 21st century, Elend has been a lot more ambitious, so to say, with their approach. And if they can release anything similar to this in this time period, I definitely want to hear it. As for more modern day albums that resemble neoclassical darkwave, one that I've noticed people tend to talk about whenever I search up this style of music is Anna von Hausswolff with her 2018 full-length Dead Magic. To be honest, I feel kind of weird calling this a neoclassical darkwave album because I'm familiar with Anna von Hausswolff's work, and I think she does a phenomenal job of creating like more of like these ethereal singer-songwriter ambient songs that I've always looked at her that she's basically as if like Chelsea Wolfe was from like Scandinavia. This would be like the outcome of that. And Dead Magic, I would definitely say, is Anna von Hausswolff at her heaviest. There's a lot more of like art rock influences, and the way she utilizes the pipe organs, which is like the standout instrument that she uses in her albums, feels a lot more dense. I'll give it that. But to call it a neoclassical darkwave album overall, I don't personally hear it, but there are forms on this album that resemble it. Again, it's very ethereal. The art rock tends to be a bit more progressive, that leans into like classical influence at a time. And yeah, the pipe organs do kind of give off the compositions and like backdrops similar to that of darkwave, that I feel like overall it's a great album. I feel like this is the best place to start out with Anna von Hausswolff, especially if you're a metal fan, because again, I do feel like this is her densest album to date. But for me personally, maybe I just gotta hear it a few more times, but from what I've heard listening to it the times that I have, I wouldn't necessarily call it neoclassical darkwave. However, one that is undeniably in the realms of neoclassical darkwave that is modern, that honestly a lot of people do know because of all the critical acclaim she's gotten throughout the internet, would be Lingua Ignota. So this is a one-woman project, all composed by Christian Hayter, yet it goes under the alias, obviously, of Lingua Ignota here. And to state that it is neoclassical darkwave is really selling it short, because yes, while those styles are predominant with really any release you check out in the discography, like my personal favorite, that being Caligula, to the fan favorite, that being Sinners Get Ready, it has a lot of other experimentations and styles being played here, such as death industrial, dark ambience, and forms of like gospel music, that it just comes off so much more deranged, sinister, and tormented sounding that easily out of everything here, this is the most abrasive and harsh of the bunch. That I've always viewed it when I listen to Lingua Ignota. It feels like a mixture between like the neoclassical influences that Dead Can Dance did, mixed with like the tormented and deranged nature of something you would get out of like Diamanda Gallus. Even though more than likely Lingua Ignota is the most known thing here that I'll be talking about in this video, I feel like for individuals who are following the timeline of this style of music to present day, this should be the last thing you listen to for its just very sinister, destructive, and abrasive nature that it unleashes to the listener. Because just like what I talked about earlier by the album from Elend, where it sounds like something that's both beautiful and frightening at the same time, Lingua Ignota is basically that, but just tenfolded, to the point that it's just really all frightening, and the beauty is kind of camouflaged by just the abrasive wall of noise that you'll hear during some parts. But again, it's definitely worth mentioning because it's very monumental for more of like the modern day approach for neoclassical darkwave. As for the legacy for neoclassical darkwave, it's weaved its way into a lot of things that have more than likely gone under the radar of a lot of people. One of the most impactful things it's done in pop culture is that it's found itself into a lot of soundtracks for big budget motion pictures. One of the best examples that I can give you is Lisa Gerrard, one of the two founding members to that of Dead Can Dance, worked with Hans Zimmer, a composer that has worked on so many soundtracks for motion pictures that it's too many to name, worked together on the soundtrack for the movie The Gladiator. And on the outro track for the album soundtrack, titled Now We Are Free, that has Lisa Gerrard singing, it resembles the ethereal nature of this style of music to a T. Which, it's also worth mentioning as well, Dead Can Dance's music was featured on quite a handful of motion picture soundtracks, primarily for their album The Serpent's Egg, as some of the material was featured on the soundtrack for The Mist and Unfaithful. And just like what I talked about way earlier on in the video with In the Nursery, who primarily focused their works on soundtracks, thus their approach for neoclassical darkwave is a lot more cinematic. A lot of their music was featured in soundtracks for Beowulf, The Aviator, and even Interview with a Vampire. But for me personally, the best representation of neoclassical darkwave being applied onto a soundtrack wouldn't be on a movie soundtrack, but actually towards a video game soundtrack, that being for the game called Hollow Knight. I'll try my best not to deviate too much from talking about music onto video games here, but Hollow Knight honestly is one of the last video games that comes to mind that I really immersed myself with. Because while the gameplay is obviously influenced by Castlevania as it's side-scrolling and it's a really action-packed in terms of how you fight bosses and enemies within it, it's the art design and overall mood and setting of this game that really kind of like clicked with me a lot, and the neoclassical darkwave soundtrack that's provided in the game really fleshes out the setting quite nicely. Because even though when it comes to like of the more action-packed and boss battles, the music tends to be a lot more in the classical sense that it's very urgent and like upbeat, like it comes to the parts within the game where you're trying to map out everything or just kind of get immersed into the setting, that it gets really ethereal and really starts to flesh out more of like the Darkwave influence, and the classical parts kind of bleed in through bits and pieces. That, yeah, honestly, if you listen to the soundtrack of this game, it's just straight up neoclassical Darkwave throughout its majority of its runtime, and it's really cool to see that this style of music found its way into a really successful game, that being Hollow Knight. That I feel weird saying, hey, you should play Hollow Knight, as I'm not really a video game kind of channel. I really don't know what you guys at least would be interested with, but for the people, again, getting into neoclassical Darkwave, I would honestly recommend this soundtrack as a whole because honestly, it's gorgeous overall. For my closing remarks, I know this is different for this channel. It's an explaining video for the first time that isn't metal related, but I feel like neoclassical Darkwave, even though it's so integrated in the gothic scene, should appeal to metal fans because, again, as you can just tell by the subgenre's name, it has Darkwave, it's dark, it's moody, it can be cryptic at times, and it matches the tone of the dark attitude of most metal albums, especially black metal. That, I don't know, I feel like when I'm looking for more of like this low-key, low-energy music that still radiates the same attitude and vibe of like dark, evil, kind of like sounding metal albums, this resonates with me, honestly, perfectly, I feel like. And just overall, I think it's a very great genre that doesn't get talked about enough, and hopefully from this video it interests some of you guys to pursue into it, because honestly, there are some gems within this style of music that doesn't get enough amount of attention. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, everything I talked about will be linked below in the description, and really curious to know what you think of neoclassical Darkwave. And as I'm sure there are a lot of neoclassical Darkwave projects and bands that I didn't get to mention in this video, so definitely let me know in the comments. And that'll do it. So like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.